Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Today, we're focusing on something most of us enjoy every single day without really thinking about it.
Let me guess.
Coffee. Well, coffee roasting,
Hmm.
specifically. Using some really insightful guides and articles from Coffee at Corner, we're going to explore how those beans transform from, well, beans to the delicious brew we all know and love.
It's fascinating, right? Like, we drink coffee all the time, but how many of us really understand what goes on behind the scenes?
Exactly. Now, Coffee at Corner starts by saying that roasting, though it seems uh, kind of complex at first glance, it's actually achievable at home with the right knowledge and tools. What do you think about that?
Well, like anything, I think the perceived difficulty of coffee roasting really depends on, a bunch of things. The experience you bring to it, the type of beans you're working with, the equipment you're using. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Okay, so multiple factors at play.
Hmm.
What would you say are like the top three things that could make roasting tricky for a beginner?
Hmm. Good question. Well, the article mentions experience for sure. Just like any skill, practice makes perfect. Those first few attempts might be a bit hit or miss. But over time, you develop a feel for the process, a sort of intuition about how the beans are reacting to the heat. That takes time.
Makes sense. What else?
Bean type can definitely throw a curveball. Different beans, different origins, different processing methods, all of that impacts how they behave during roasting. Some beans might be more forgiving, while others require a more delicate touch. It's a learning curve.
So, like, you can't just approach every bean the same way.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's equipment. Now, basic home setups do exist, simple things you can use over a stovetop. But if you really want consistency and control, those specialized home roasters with all the bells and whistles, they make a huge difference.
That all comes down to control, I guess. So, speaking of, Coffee at Corner provides a simplified four-step guide for roasting at home. Preheating, heating the roaster, cooling, and then, well, the final roast. But knowing there's all this nuance, where do you think beginners often uh, go wrong, even with a simplified guide?
I'd say often it's the preheating stage. The guide mentions it, sure, but it doesn't really get into the specifics. Even heating is like super crucial for a consistent roast. Some home roasters use hot air, others rely on heat from a drum. It all impacts how the roast develops.
So preheating is more than just like flipping a switch.
Exactly. And then there's the heating the roaster itself step. Coffee at Corner suggests using a wire mesh roaster over an open flame, which allows for good heat distribution, but it requires constant attention to avoid scorching the beans.
Yeah, that sounds tricky. Okay, what about the cooling stage? That has to be more than just leaving them out on the counter, right?
Right. Cooling is just as important as the heating phase. You got to rapidly and evenly cool those beans down to stop the roasting process at the precise moment you want. Think of it like quenching a hot piece of metal. It stops the chemical reactions happening inside. Slow cooling. You risk over roasting, getting unwanted bitterness.
So many things to consider. Finally, there's that final roast stage. The guide mentions that roast time affects the flavor, shorter roasts being lighter, longer roasts being darker.
Mm.
But what does that actually mean in terms of taste? Like, how does that translate to what we experience in the cup?
Imagine a spectrum of flavor, right? On one end, you have those light roasts, bright acidity, delicate floral and fruity notes. Think like a Kenyan coffee with black currant hints. Then, as you move towards darker roasts, those flavors deepen, become more caramelized, chocolatey, nutty, like a classic Sumatra.
So it's almost like painting with heat, creating different layers of flavor depending on how long you roast. And speaking of layers, Coffee at Corner also mentions this more detailed five-stage breakdown of the roasting process. I'm guessing that gets into the nitty-gritty of how those flavors actually develop, right?
Absolutely. Each stage, from the very first cleaning of the beans to that final cool down, contributes to the symphony of flavors you end up with in your cup. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. You mentioned that five-stage breakdown, right? Let's dig into that a bit. First up, cleaning. Seems basic, but super important. It's all about getting rid of the chaff, that papery husk around the bean, before you even start roasting.
Why is that?
Well, think about it. You want even heat distribution, right? No burnt or bitter flavors from stray bits of chaff. It's like prepping your ingredients before cooking. You wouldn't want any random stuff in your final dish.
Makes sense. So, clean beans, check. What's next?
Heating. This is where things start to get interesting. You gradually bring those beans up to the right temperature, usually somewhere between 350 and 370 degrees Fahrenheit.
That's pretty hot.
It is. And that heat is what kicks off all those amazing chemical reactions inside the bean, complex compounds breaking down, new ones forming. It's like chemistry in action.
So it's not just about browning the beans. There's a lot happening on a molecular level.
Mm.
What's the next big moment in this whole transformation?
That would be the first crack. A pivotal point in the roasting journey.
Dramatic name.
It is pretty dramatic. As the beans heat up, they release gases, mostly carbon dioxide. That builds up pressure inside. And eventually, boom, the pressure gets so high, the bean literally cracks, makes this popping sound. It's a signal that the real roasting is underway.
So you can actually hear the beans transforming.
You can. And then comes the development stage. This is where the roaster's skill really shines. The beans keep changing color, going from green to all those shades of brown we associate with roasted coffee. You start to see smoke, smell those amazing coffee aromas, and the roaster has to make decisions, adjusting the heat, airflow, all to bring out the flavors they're looking for.
It sounds almost like an art form, like sculpting with heat and time. What kind of things does the roaster have to pay attention to during that development stage?
It's a multi-sensory thing. They're looking at the color of the beans, smelling for those telltale signs of caramelization, bitterness, even listening to the sounds the beans make, those crackles and pops. It's like conducting an orchestra, bringing all these elements together to create a harmonious flavor profile.
So much more than just, like, setting a timer. And then finally, what happens?
The grand finale! The cooling stage! Time to stop those chemical reactions, lock in the flavors you worked so hard to develop.
I'm guessing that's more complicated than just turning off the heat.
Right, you have to cool those beans down quickly and evenly. Different methods like air cooling, water quenching, each with its own effects on the final flavor.
Wow, it's amazing how much precision goes into every single step. No wonder people consider coffee roasting an art form.
It is. It's science and creativity coming together. Speaking of history, coffee roasting has been around for ages, with techniques evolving from, those simple methods to the super sophisticated processes we see today.
Really? I never thought about the history of it.
It's fascinating. Imagine, like, centuries ago, no fancy equipment. How would you roast coffee then?
Over a fire, maybe?
Exactly. Many cultures used to roast beans in simple pans, clay pots, over an open fire. Had to keep those beans moving, prevent burning. Took real skill.
That sounds challenging.
It was. But then, as technology advanced, so did roasting methods. We started to see dedicated roasting machines, from small hand-cranked ones to huge industrial-scale roasters.
So the way we roast coffee has mirrored our technological advancements.
It has, but no matter what method you use, the basic principles remain the same. It's all about controlling heat and airflow to transform those green beans into something truly delicious. Speaking of delicious, remember those roast levels we talked about earlier? That spectrum of flavors from light to dark?
Yeah, starting to understand how much that impacts the taste.
Coffee at Corner gets into some cool details about that, connecting those roast levels to the specific chemical reactions that happen during roasting. Lighter roasts, for example, they hold on to more of the bean's natural acidity. That's what gives you those bright, fruity notes like you get in those African coffees.
So it's not just about roasting time. It's about what's happening chemically inside the bean. What about those darker roasts, then? What makes them so different?
For darker roasts, it's all about the Maillard reaction. That's a chemical reaction that happens at higher temperatures, creates those rich, caramelized, chocolatey flavors you find in roasts like French roast or espresso roast.
So that's what gives them that depth and complexity, learning so much. It's amazing how much science is baked into, roasted into coffee.
It really is. And the more we understand about it, the more we can appreciate all the work that goes into creating that perfect cup. Something else to think about is the ethics of coffee, the sourcing, the roasting. Ever thought about where your beans come from, how they were produced?
Honestly, not really. I usually just grab a bag from the store without thinking too much about it.
It's worth considering. Coffee is a global commodity, and our choices as consumers really affect the lives of coffee farmers, the environment.
You're right. So what are some things we should look for when choosing beans then?
Certifications are a good start. Things like fair trade, organic. Fair trade ensures farmers get a fair price for their beans. And organic means the coffee was grown without harmful pesticides, herbicides.
So by choosing those certified coffees, we can support better practices.
Exactly. And a lot of specialty roasters go even further, building direct relationships with farmers, paying higher prices for quality beans. It benefits everyone involved, from the farmer to the coffee drinker.
That's good to know. Sounds like there's a whole world of ethical coffee to discover. But what about the roasting itself? Does that play a role in all of this?
Absolutely. Responsible roasters care about their environmental impact. They'll use energy-efficient equipment, minimize waste, even find ways to recycle those coffee byproducts like chaff. Some even donate to organizations that support coffee communities.
So there are ways to be more sustainable at every step, from the farm to our cup.
There are. And by being informed consumers, we can all contribute to a better coffee industry.
Well said. I gotta admit, this deep dive has really opened my eyes. I'm looking at my morning coffee in a whole new light now.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really amazing, isn't it? Who would have thought there was so much to learn about coffee roasting? It's like the science, the skill, the ethical side of it all. I'm looking at my cup of coffee totally differently now.
Me too.
Yeah.
It makes you appreciate that moment, when you take that first sip. You're tasting the history, the hard work, the passion that goes into every single bean.
Yeah, absolutely. I gotta admit, I'm feeling a bit inspired after all this. Might even try roasting at home someday. What about you? What stuck with you most from this deep dive?
For me, it's the idea that coffee roasting is a journey. Like there's always something new to discover, right? A new bean, a different technique, even just a tiny change to your brewing method can make a huge difference.
It's like a whole world of flavor waiting to be explored. You were talking earlier about how different beans from different places have their own unique flavors. Could you, give us some examples? Paint us a picture.
Oh, absolutely. Let's take a trip around the world of coffee. Imagine a cup of Ethiopian Yirgacheffe, known for its delicate floral aromas, a little hint of citrus, and this bright, almost tea-like acidity. Then you have a Sumatran Mandhealing, totally different, earthy, full-bodied notes of dark chocolate and spice. Or how about a Colombian Supremo? Classic, crowd pleaser, balanced with caramel sweetness, nutty undertones, smooth finish.
Wow, it's incredible how diverse it is. Each origin has its own personality.
Right. And that's just the beginning. When you start looking at processing methods, how those coffee cherries are handled after harvesting, the flavors get even more interesting. You have natural processed coffees where the cherries are dried whole in the sun. They usually have this sweeter, fruitier character. Washed coffees where they remove the pulp before drying, those are known for their cleaner, brighter acidity. And then there's honey processed coffees, somewhere in between, balancing sweetness and acidity.
So much goes into it, even before the roasting.
Exactly. It's not just about the bean itself, it's about the entire journey, from farm to cup. And every step along the way shapes the final flavor. No wonder people get so passionate about coffee.
It's contagious, that passion. Once you start paying attention to all these details, you really get drawn in. It becomes more than just a drink. It's like an experience.
I agree. It's a way to connect with the cultures all over the world, really.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've gone deep into the mechanics of roasting, explored how those flavors develop, and even touched on the importance of ethical choices. A true deep dive into coffee roasting.
Definitely. And hopefully our listeners are feeling inspired to, maybe try a new roast, explore a different origin, even try roasting at home. The possibilities are endless.
Absolutely. So, to everyone listening, we leave you with this final thought. If you could create your perfect cup of coffee, what would it taste like? What aromas would fill your kitchen as you grind those freshly roasted beans? Would it be a bright, lively Ethiopian Yirgacheffe? A rich, earthy Sumatran Mandhealing? Or maybe something completely unique, a blend of flavors that reflects your own personal taste? Let your imagination run wild. Who knows? You might just discover your new favorite coffee. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.